In March of 1974, a Filipino farmer was walking near the edge of the jungle on the island of Lubang in the Philippines when he saw something that stopped him cold. A man stepped out of the trees. He was thin. His uniform was rotting off his body, patched and repatched so many times it barely held together. He was carrying a rifle, a working rifle, cleaned and oiled, and he moved the way soldiers move, low, careful, watching everything. The farmer ran. He ran because he knew what that man was. The island had known for years. There was a Japanese soldier still fighting in the jungle. His name was Hiroo Onoda. He was 52 years old, and he had been fighting the Second World War every single day since 1945. The war had been over for 29 years. This is the story of the most loyal soldier who ever lived. Or, depending on how you look at it, the most tragic one. And I think, by the end, you might not be sure which one he was. I'm not sure I am either. To understand Hiroo Onoda, you have to understand what it meant to be a Japanese soldier in the Second World War. Not from our perspective, looking back with everything we know now, but from his. Onoda was born in 1922 in a small village in Japan. He was studious, disciplined, and deeply serious from a young age. He joined the Imperial Japanese Army as a young man and was sent for special intelligence training, the kind of training given to soldiers who were expected to operate alone behind enemy lines for extended periods of time. This is important. He wasn't trained to fight conventional battles and then go home. He was trained to survive in hostile territory, to gather intelligence, to wage guerrilla warfare, and to keep fighting no matter what. The Japanese military of that era had a particular philosophy about surrender. You may have heard of it. Surrender was not considered an option. It was considered a disgrace. To yourself, to your family, to your country. Soldiers were expected to fight to the last, to die before giving up. Onoda had absorbed this completely. It was not just his training, it was his identity. In December of 1944, he was sent to the island of Lubang in the Philippines with a small group of soldiers. Their mission was to disrupt Allied operations on the island and slow the American advance. Before he left, his commanding officer gave him orders that were clear and absolute. You are to continue to carry out your mission even if Japan surrenders. Do not give yourself up. Keep fighting until you receive new orders. That is a direct command. Onoda's commanding officer, December 1944. Onoda took those words seriously. He took them more seriously than anyone could have imagined. August 15th, 1945. Japan surrendered. The Second World War was over. In Tokyo, people wept in the streets. In New York, they danced. In London, they lit fires. All across the world, in 1,000 different ways, humanity exhaled. In the jungle on the island of Lubang, Hiroo Onoda heard nothing. He and the small group of soldiers with him had been cut off from communication for months. They didn't know about the surrender. And when leaflets were dropped over the island in the weeks that followed, leaflets explaining that the war was over, urging remaining soldiers to come out, Onoda read them and concluded they were Allied propaganda. He had been trained to expect exactly that: enemy deception, fake surrender notices, psychological warfare. So he stayed in the jungle, and he kept fighting. Over the next several years, his small group dwindled. One soldier surrendered in 1950. Onoda considered him a traitor. One was killed in a skirmish with Filipino police in 1954. His last companion was shot dead in 1972 during a confrontation that Onoda had initiated, believing he was attacking enemy forces. By 1972, Hiroo Onoda was completely alone. He had been in the jungle for 27 years. and he still believed the war was going on. I want you to think for a moment about what 29 years actually means. 29 years is long enough for a child to be born and grow up and have children of their own. It is long enough for a city to be rebuilt from rubble. It is long enough for the entire shape of the world to change. While Hiroo Onoda was in the jungle, the Korean War was fought and ended. Television came into most American homes. A man walked on the moon. The Vietnam War began and ended. The world went from black and white to color, in photographs and in reality. And Onoda was in the jungle, cleaning his rifle, surviving on bananas and coconuts and whatever he could find or catch, sleeping in shelters he built himself from jungle materials, moving constantly so he couldn't be tracked, staying alive. He was extraordinary at staying alive. You have to give him that. Every skill his training had given him, he used. He was disciplined and methodical. He kept records. He maintained his weapons. He mapped the island in his head until he knew every trail, every stream, every clearing. He was, by any objective measure, one of the most remarkable survivors in human history. He was also completely, utterly alone. The Filipino government was aware of him. They launched search operations. They dropped more leaflets. In 1959, they declared him legally dead in absentia, though everyone on the island knew he was still out there. Farmers reported stolen food. Occasional shots were fired from the jungle's edge. In the 1960s, his own family traveled to the island and broadcast messages over loudspeakers, pleading with him to come out. His brother, his sister, his father, standing at the edge of the jungle, calling his name. He didn't come out. He heard them. He admitted later that he heard them. But he had been trained to expect enemy deception, and he could not bring himself to believe, after so many years, that any of it was real. Or perhaps he simply couldn't afford to believe it. Because if it was real, if the war really had been over since 1945, then what had the last 20 years been for? In 1974, a young Japanese student named Norio Suzuki decided to do something that governments and military operations had failed to do for nearly 30 years. He went looking for Onoda, not with a squad of soldiers, not with loudspeakers and official declarations, just Suzuki, alone, with a backpack and a tent, walking into the jungle on Lubang Island and calling Onoda's name. Suzuki later said he went because he was curious. He had a list of things he wanted to find in his life. Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. He said it casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. But whatever his reasons, it worked. After a few days in the jungle, Onoda found him. Or rather, Onoda let himself be found. He came out of the trees and stood in front of this young man with his rifle in his hands and studied him for a long time. They talked. For hours they talked. Suzuki told him the war was over, had been over since 1945, that Japan had surrendered, that the world he was fighting to protect had moved on, rebuilt itself, and become something entirely different. Onoda listened, and then he said what he had said every other time someone had tried to tell him the same thing. He said he could not surrender without orders from his commanding officer. Suzuki went back to Japan. He tracked down Onoda's former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who was by then retired and working as a bookseller. He explained the situation, and Taniguchi, to his enormous credit, agreed to go. On March 9th, 1974, Major Taniguchi traveled to the island of Lubang. He put on his old uniform. He walked into the jungle, and he found Hiroo Onoda. He gave him his orders, formally, in person. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Onoda was to lay down his arms immediately. Onoda stood at attention. He listened to his commanding officer. And then, for the first time in 29 years, he put down his rifle. He later said that in that moment, he wept. Not with relief, with grief. He wept for the men who had died with him in the jungle. He wept for the Filipino civilians who had been caught in skirmishes he had initiated, believing he was fighting an ongoing war. He wept for the years. He was 52 years old. He had gone into the jungle at 23. He had given 29 years to a war that had already ended before he turned 24. When Hiroo Onoda walked out of the jungle, he was holding his rifle, his ammunition, his military dagger, and a hand grenade. Everything still in working condition. Everything still ready. The Philippine president at the time, Ferdinand Marcos, officially pardoned him for the actions he had taken during his years in the jungle. There had been casualties, Filipino farmers and police officers caught in confrontations Onoda had initiated over the decades. The pardon was controversial, but Marcos gave it. Onoda flew back to Japan. He was greeted as a hero by some, and as a relic of something dark and shameful by others. Japan in 1974 was a prosperous, modernized country that had spent 30 years trying to move past the war. Onoda was a living reminder of the ideology it had tried to leave behind. He found it hard to be there. He said Japan felt foreign to him. The people, the noise, the pace of it. All of it felt wrong after 3 decades in silence and green. He moved to Brazil. He raised cattle. He lived quietly for many years. Eventually, he returned to Japan, where he established a nature school for young people, teaching wilderness survival skills, the same skills that had kept him alive for 29 years in the Philippine jungle. He married, he gave interviews, he wrote a memoir. He never, as far as anyone knows, stopped believing that he had done the right thing. He had been given orders. He had followed them. That was who he was. That was all he knew how to be. He died in January of 2014. He was 91 years old. I have been thinking about how to end this video since I started writing it. Because Hiroo Onoda's story doesn't end the way most stories end. There is no simple lesson. There is no clean moral. He was loyal beyond all reason, loyal to a cause that had been lost before he was even fully committed to it. He was brave in a way that most of us will never be called upon to be. He survived, alone, in conditions that would have broken almost anyone else on Earth. And because of that loyalty, because of that bravery, because of that survival, people died who didn't have to die. Filipino farmers going about their lives on an island where a war had ended before many of them were born. People who had no idea there was a soldier in the jungle who still believed he was the enemy. How do you hold both of those things at once? I think about the moment Major Taniguchi walked into that jungle in his old uniform. I think about what it must have taken for him to do that. To look at a man who had spent 29 years obeying his last command, and to finally release him from it. And I think about Onoda, standing at attention, listening, choosing one last time to follow orders, choosing to put down the rifle. He wept for the men who had died with him. He wept for the years. What do you weep for when the thing you gave everything to turns out to have been over before it really began? I don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure there is one. What I know is this: Hiroo Onoda believed in something completely, so completely that he gave it 3 decades of his one life. And when it was finally over, he walked out of the jungle carrying everything he had gone in with: his rifle, his dagger, his discipline, his grief, and a kind of dignity that, whatever you think of his cause is almost impossible not to respect. If this story made you think about loyalty, about belief, about the price of following orders without question, then please consider subscribing to Old Glory Stories. Every week we find the people history forgot to write about, or wrote about too quickly, without stopping to wonder what it actually felt like to be there. I'll see you in the next one.